Hey everybody, well, it's time for chapter 4, our overview, and this chapter is about competing in the world markets. There isn't probably anybody out there that hasn't heard of the world, either heard the words global economy or e-commerce. Well, there's a reason why we trade and have imports and exports. Now, the book talks about our totals, right? So for the US, we have $1.5 trillion annual imports, right? Uh, excuse me, imports versus one. Oh my goodness. I get my numbers all mixed up here. Our exports are 1.5 trillion. Our imports are 2.3 trillion, which means that we buy a lot more stuff than we sell. Okay. And why we need to understand this, why do nations trade? Well, first and foremost, we can't get everything we need here, right? Or everything we want here. We have to have other sources for those factors of production that we talked about in earlier chapters, and we have huge markets. So let's just look at those factors of production. You know, availability, price, is quality, quantity, capital, access to natural resources. All of those things are, play into how much or what you're going to buy from other countries. And just the size of international markets, if we look at that aspect of it, it's just more opportunities. I mean, if you look at table 4.1 in your book, the world's top 10 nations based on population and wealth. In China, the population is in millions. 343, 1,205 in India, 313 in the United States. So just the sheer volume of these markets open up a lot of opportunities that might not have been there otherwise. And if you look at figure 4.1 that shows the top 10 trading partners with the United States, you see the number one is Canada, China, and then Mexico, those top three. And by doing this, we have a lot of different advantages. We have both absolute and comparative advantages. And the book, gives you some brief, just a brief description of those. The absolute advantage, my goodness, I've really got a frog in my throat today. We don't really see that much anymore. That's where like you're the only one that can make it, right? You can't get it anywhere else. Nowadays, I mean, go on the internet. You can't. There's like nothing you can't hardly find anymore, right? There's more. You're more likely to see a comparative advantage, meaning that you can make it better, bigger, faster, more efficiently. That's what's giving you your competitive advantage. So there's other people out there doing it. They're just not doing it as good as you, right? So if we're going to be doing all this different trade stuff, right, we have to measure it in some way. So that's where the measuring trade between nations comes into this. We want to look at trade surpluses and trade deficits. So just think about your checkbook, right? So if you have a positive balance of trade, it's a surplus. That means you got more money in your check count. Ooh, you can go shopping, right? But if you have a negative balance of trade, that's a trade deficit. That means you don't have enough money in your checking account to cover your bills, let alone go shopping, right? So that's all it means. And the same thing applies to our balance of payments. So do you have enough going in and out to cover what you need to? Major U.S. exports and imports. They give us a handy dandy little table here, 4.2, top 10 U.S. merchandise exports and imports. Geez, look at that. Number one, agricultural commodities. And you can go right down the list and look at those top 10. So now we're going to be buying and selling across borders, right? So we need an exchange rate. It's not as complicated as you might think. We have tables that do it for you now. We have calculators that do it. Go on Google and just say exchange rate calculator. Oh, you can just go right in there and say, okay, how much is the dollar worth in Brazil today, right? I'll give you a practical example. I go to Canada every year for a couple of weeks on vacation by myself on my motorcycle, camping and touring, right? I know it sounds crazy, but it's not. So when I went this year, when I get to the border to exchange my U.S. money for Canadian money, my dollar got me $1.20 in Canadian money. So the dollar was stronger. I got a little bit more extra. I got a little, I don't know if that's proper grammar, a little more extra Canadian money for my dollar. Last year or the year before, whichever it was, oh my gosh, it was hugely different. It was horrible. Our dollar was really weak. It was devalued. You see that definition of devaluation in your book. It was devalued. So when I gave them $1 at the border, I got like 75 cents back. So it cost me a lot more dollars to do stuff, eat, buy fuel for my bike, camping, whatever, in Canada. So these are real effects on the economy. So just think about, let's say, just a few years back when we were having our big, after 2008, when we were having our big crash. Europe was doing very well. The euro was doing very well. And when you don't have a lot of money to spend, you think about how far your dollar is going to take you, right? What can I get for my dollar? Well, if your dollar was only going to get you about 50 euros, so we have dollars, they have euros, right? So 1 euro, $1. They're not always valued equally. Nothing's ever valued equally, or usually not. So if your dollar was only going to get you 50 cents worth of euros, are you going to travel to Europe? Oh my gosh, their tourism industry took a huge hit because our dollar was devalued. We couldn't buy as much stuff as we wanted to, plane tickets, hotel rooms, touristy things that we do, so we didn't go. Everybody was doing the staycation. Remember that phrase, right? Well, that has to do with exchange rate. So there's real practical application when you think about traveling somewhere and what the exchange rate is. Now, barriers to international trade. You can see figure 4.2 at the bottom of the page, top of the page, bottom of the page, wherever it is. There's different barriers to international trade. You don't get to just, say, oh, I'm just going to open up my doors in Mexico. You can't get away with that. There's barriers. So this little diagram shows us, I think yours is on the top of your page, it's on the bottom of mine. Global business, there's social and cultural barriers, there's economic barriers, legal and political barriers, and then free market barriers, okay? So if you look at the social and cultural differences, well, you should probably already have a good idea what that might be. Number one being just the language. So if we all don't speak the same language, that can be a real problem, right? And in your book, I want you to make sure that you look at that thinking globally about business in that little career kickstart section in your book. I think it's page, whatever it is, 101 or so. But take a look at that because those are real considerations. If you can't speak the language, you're going to struggle. Values and religious attitudes. You have to think about different countries' value system. What is their religion? How is it different from ours? So, for example, well, the book gives you some examples. You can read this. But, there's countries, for example, where you can't drink. Well, you aren't going to open up a liquor store, there are you? Because there's a value and a religious difference there that will keep you from being able to do that. There's economic differences, which is huge, like infrastructure. If you go from state to state in the United States, they're not all that different. I think when I travel in Iowa, I find a lot more gravel roads. If you go out west, you're going to bump into more gravel roads. In Wisconsin, most things are paved. We have a pretty good infrastructure. You can go to countries that still don't have access to the internet. So think how that might affect your business if you want to relocate somewhere. So let's say the country has really cheap labor, right? But if you need the internet to run your business, you're not going to be able to make that happen if you don't have the infrastructure, if you don't have the roads, transportation systems. There's all kinds of things that are part of the infrastructure. Currency conversion and shifts, that's pretty much like what we've been talking about. Then there's also those political and legal differences. What's the political climate? How stable is the economy? Or excuse me, how stable is their politics? Do you want to go over to look what's happening in the Middle East? Do we want to open a business over there? I mean, there's tons of opportunities, don't get me wrong, but you do have to consider, where they're at. Are they having a coup? Is someone fighting? Are there rebels trying to take over the government? Things like that. You see the same kinds of things that happen in Central and South America, right? So you have to look at the political environment. Then, of course, the legal environment. And there's three major areas. When we talk about the legal environment, what are the U.S. laws, right? You have to follow those laws. You have to follow the international regulations, because we do have international trade regulations. And then you have to think about the laws of the country that you're going to be in. So there's a lot of barriers that can get in the way, or not, that you just need to consider before you go global. That's why some companies just don't go global, right? The book goes into a little more detail about the international regulations, some of that stuff. Types of trade restrictions. That's, again, another barrier, right? Like tariffs. They get into talking about tariffs and non-tariffs. Tariffs, just think Cuba, right? Think of places that have embargoes like Cuba, heavy taxing, things like that. Then there's non-tariff barriers, which are like administrative barriers. They're not physical barriers. And the book, and I want you to just kind of read these definitions, because again, it's terminology that'll help you be better versed in business overall, so that you understand what it means to meet a quota, right? to understand what dumping means. Dumping, like videos and DVDs and CDs in the Chinese and Japanese markets, they do a lot of dumping there through those markets. Embargoes like Cuba. Oh, and we're opening Cuba up. Oh my gosh, I would love to go to Cuba. And exchange control. So read those definitions so you get a better understanding and build your vocabulary. But there are different ways we can reduce barriers to international trade, and that, like NAFTA, for example. And the book goes on to talk about that. So look at those organizations that are promoting international trade. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which is the GATT, World Trade Organization, the World Bank, International Monetary Fund. Just read through those. They didn't go too heavily into them, but they're just all basically do the same thing. They're organizations that are really trying to promote international trade. So international economic conditions. Now, some of this is to help us remove some of those barriers, like trade agreements, like NAFTA. So read what NAFTA means. The Central American Dominican Republican Free Trade Agreement, read about that. Our European Union. All of these things, if you become participants within these trade organizations, can help bring down those barriers, okay? So now glowing global. Go, blah, blah, blah. Glowing or going? We're going global. Going global. So when you're going to expand into overseas markets, there's a lot to consider. So you have to determine which foreign markets you want to enter into, look at all of those key factors, look at different ways that you can maybe organize your business. So that's where you have to decide what level of involvement. So you say, okay, maybe I will consider going global. I've looked at all these different things, and I think that I can really make some money that way because they have cheaper this, cheaper that, or whatever. So level of involvement. You either can be an exporter, importer. You can use contractual agreements like franchising and licensing, things like that, or direct investment in foreign markets. They also, I don't know what page it's on in your book, table 4.3, international trade research resources on the internet. That's a good place to start. So if you have a business idea, let's say you're in this class because you're going to get a biz management degree, right? And you want to open up your own business. Maybe someday you want to go global. Look at these resources to give you some ideas on trade research, okay? Importer, exporter, I think that's pretty self-explanatory because we know what they both mean. Counter trade, that's interesting. Think barter system, right? That's something new. So read the definition of that. Contractual agreements like franchising. You guys are going to take a look at franchising in an assignment a little bit more deeply. Foreign licensing, think royalties. When you license something, you're going to get a royalty for it. Subcontracting. Well, guess what? Adjunct instructors, those are subcontractors. If you've ever worked in construction, you probably know what a subcontractor means. It's really big in the news right now. I mean, and this is a real consideration for companies. The law is starting, the EEOC and those governing bodies are starting to look at the way we treat subcontracting. Are we being ethically and morally sound in the way that we treat people that are part-time workers? Subcontracting is kind of a fancy pants way to say part-time, non-permanent employee. We often aren't paying them the same way. We're not offering benefits in the same way. Well, that's going to change. We've got some laws now and some governing bodies just in the news. I think I just read in Business Week 2 weeks ago. I think it was 2 weeks ago. Talking about this issue. Offshoring, we've talked a little bit about that in an earlier chapter. International direct investment. Now, the international direct investment, I think it's on page 113 in the binder version. This is when you're really the most involved. Like if you look at the definition, investing directly in production and marketing operations in a foreign country, it's the ultimate level of global involvement. And if you're gonna go at that level, you're probably pretty well versed with global marketing. And I think I'm looking at one other new thing that the binder version was talking about was reshoring, actually bringing production back to the United States. And I just probably about 3-4 years ago, I was working for a company up in the Eau Claire area, and they had actually closed their Mexico facility and were bringing all their work back to the United States. So they were reshoring it, right? So from multinational corporation to global business, you have to have a strategy, and that's where they talk about developing an international strategy, and it's very complex. There's just a brief introduction to the topic here, not really much for me to comment on. And then multi-domestic business strategies or an adaptive strategy. So just review that. One other interesting piece before I quit here, I'm hitting my 15-minute limit here. Bribery or the cost of doing business. I think it's in the solving an ethical controversy box in your book there, or in your binder. And it's kind of an interesting concept because there's a lot of countries that do what we would call bribing, which is illegal for us, but they don't consider it illegal because it's not part of their culture. And I think the example in the book might be the Chinese example. And I don't even know how to pronounce that, and I'm not going to try. In Mexico, there's a phrase, uno mordido, just a little bit more. And so there's international considerations when it comes to trying to bridge this cultural difference in how we pay for things, let's say. So take a look at that ethical controversy. Well, there you go. I'm at my limit. 16 minutes. Oh my gosh, cut her off. Give her the hook. We'll see you next time.